What's up, everybody? Alex J here for MusicMastermind.tv. Today, we're going to talk all about dynamics. Let's start from the bottom up. What are compressors? In essence, compressors are devices used to reduce the dynamic range of a signal or signals. But what is dynamic range, you might ask? Dynamic range refers to the span between the softest and the loudest levels of a sound. Compression can make music more pleasing and thicker as you shape sounds into the mix, and they can add a lot of life to normally dull or boring sources. In order for our music to sound good or natural, we have to reduce the dynamic range of the signals when recording and mixing music in order for our brain to understand and interpret these sources. Let's put it in context. Let's say you record two singers, one whispering and the other one screaming. And let's say we match their levels accordingly. Do you think the whisper would be audible? The answer is obviously no. The screaming just fills up the spectrum of loudness and has way less dynamic range, so it will probably drown the whisper even if they're at the same level. So, what do we do to hear them both? This is where compression comes in handy. By reducing dynamic range, you can tame or squash the louder parts of the signal and reduce the dynamic range on the softer parts of the signal so they can all live in the same spectrum, giving space to more sounds to coexist and be heard at the same gain level, even if they're completely different in reality. Compressors attenuate the highest parts of the signal and boost the result. You can hear the lower part of the signal being more present after the compression takes place. And even though we're understanding what compressors are and are known to be dynamics processors, there's still the question of what are dynamics? Let's answer that question. Dynamics refer to the variation of levels within a signal, which is normally represented by the transients and their respective decay. But yet again, there's more questions within that same question. What are transients? What is decay? Let's look at them both. Transients are the initial high burst of energy of a sound. Think of a snare drum for an example. When you hit a snare drum, the first hit you hear is the initial transient, then the sound sustains and decays until the vibration of the drum head stops. Compressors not only balance out the level difference between the quieter and louder parts of the signal, but can also be precise in how fast and slow they react, which affects the overall perception of the sound. Compressing ghost notes on a snare drum is a great example of how compression can make sound sources more present and natural. The rim shots on a snare are very loud compared to light ghost notes. Compressors are great tools to shape the sound of the snare drum and make those ghost notes come alive, and they do so by reducing the dynamic range so that we hear the loudest and the quietest parts of your signal equally as clear. That being said, we need to have an awareness of the effects of compression because it's also very easy to overcompress and squash information too much, and it loses its original qualities and has a negative effect on the overall composition. To understand how a compressor truly works, let's take a closer look at all of the controls on a standard compressor, moving on to more exotic settings on popular compressors. As far as controls, every compressor shares the same basic parameters: threshold, attack, release, and ratio. You'll also see a meter or meters, which can come in different flavors but are normally VU meters in most compressors, which can show different values such as output, input, and gain reduction. Let's talk about each variable control parameter in detail. Let's start with the threshold. The threshold sets the point in the signal where the gain reduction begins to work. A lower threshold will apply gain reduction to more of the signal. A higher threshold will affect less of it, only affecting aggressive peaks. Depending on what you're trying to compress or the effect that you're trying to accomplish, you can use this threshold to define what part of the signal you want to apply in the gain reduction to. In general terms, you can always check how much gain reduction you're applying by looking at the compressor's gain reduction meter, which shows up in different places depending on the model of the compressor. It's normally a function on the meter selected by a switch or a knob. Let's talk about ratio. The ratio function defines the amount of gain reduction applied after the signal has crossed the ratio. As its name clearly states, it is the ratio of the unaffected versus the affected signal. The higher the first number, the greater the factor of gain reduction. So we understand it a bit better. 1-to-1 usually means no compression. As an example, the SSL bus compressor starts at a 1.5-to-1 ratio, which is usually a very transparent and good starting point when doing any compression on the entire mix. So a 10-to-1 ratio is considered very heavy compression, and anything further than that results in extreme gain reduction, which makes the compressor act as a limiter at that point. So depending on what you're trying to compress, you need to think differently about ratios in every situation. I tend to use a 1.5-to-1 when it comes to mixed bus compression, and use moderate ratios like 2-to-1 or 3-to-1 when I'm focusing on drums to help the ghost notes come alive and such. And I'll use a 4.1 or 5.1 or beyond when I'm doing any type of parallel compression or any type of effect. Now let's talk about the attack. The attack function determines how fast the compressor reaches its full range of reduction when the signal passes the threshold. The faster the attack, the more it will smack the transients and you'll lose the punch of the original signal, so understanding the effects of the attack settings are crucial. Finally, let's look at the release. The release function sets how quickly the reduction stops after the signal drops below the threshold and the signal becomes uncompressed again. Here's a great way to think about the attack and release settings on a compressor. If you set the compressor with a fast attack and a fast release, it's going to reduce the level of the transient. If you set the compressor with a fast attack and a slow release, it's going to have an overall level reduction. And if you configure the compressor with a slow attack and a slow release, it's going to reduce the sustain level.